Thank you for joining me for this episode of God Talk. And in this episode of God Talk, I want to talk to you about something that all of us experience regularly in our lives. And that is, I want to talk to you about change and how well we process that or how well we do not process that. I remember back when I was graduating seminary, a book about change came out that was very popular. It was a short book, but it was very powerful, very inspirational in terms of just talking about those, especially who struggle with change. And the book was called "Who Moved My Cheese," and that was written by Dr. Spencer Johnson, September of 1998. And maybe you've read the book. It's been many years since it did come out. And the book's premise is basically these mice were not too receptive to change, that they would put in this labyrinth some cheese in a certain part of the maze, and the mice found it and they ate the cheese. And then the next day they put the cheese in the same area, and once again the mice went to that same area and found the cheese there, and they repeated this, and I can't remember, like, for let's just say 30 days. And the mice became very accustomed to finding the cheese in this location. And then after so many days, they ended up moving the cheese to a different part of the maze. And if I remember right, and it's been 25, 26 years since I read this book, but if I remember right, like initially for a period of time, a few days, like the mice kept going to the same part of the maze looking for their cheese. And even though the cheese wasn't there, they'd keep coming back every day, time and time again. If I remember right, going forward after a while, some of the mice abandoned looking for cheese in that location, and some actually adapted and began looking for cheese in other parts of the maze and would eventually find where it had been moved to. But there's a certain group of the mice that kept going back to the same place time and time again. And I can't remember if, like, they ended up dying of starvation or what, but like they could not adapt to the fact that someone had moved their cheese. Well, it's a true principle not only in mice, but I can attest to it. It's true also in rats. You may wonder how I know that, and that's because I've got this little, like, cart that we sell just snacks off of for the church. Like, you can get water, but then there's, like, maybe those crackers that have the peanut butter in the middle, some chips, some Cheez-Its. Had at that time had trail mix. Boy, that was the interesting thing with trail mix. So the trail mix, it would have like peanuts, it would have sunflower seeds, M&Ms, and raisins in it. And what happened is, like, these rats would find the food eventually in the closet, and they would come in there and they would get into the food. Like, there'd be like three or four Cheez-It wrappers, like, laying around, all the cheese that's gone. And then but what was interesting is, like, the trail mix, rats rats won't eat raisins. And that is a crazy thing. You would think rats would eat everything, but I kid you not, every time a trail mix package got into, you wouldn't find any peanuts, you wouldn't find any M&Ms, you wouldn't find any sunflower seeds, but there would be raisins everywhere. In fact, you'd think they were rat turds, but they weren't. They were raisins. How bad does something have to be? I'm not sure if you're a raisin fan, and I don't mean to offend you if you are, but how bad is it that even a rat won't eat a raisin? Well, at first I tried to deal with my rat problem, and so I put down these like glue traps. And I have to tell you, like, I've got a heart for animals. I mean, I catch wasps in my pool before they drown, and I grab them with my hand and I let them go. And aside from, like, flies and cockroaches, they just get to die. A fire ant that bites me, they get to die. But really, for the pretty much everything else, including even a snake, I'm gonna try to catch it and let it go. So I felt kind of bad about having these glue traps. These rats got stuck in it. They just look at you with their beady eyes. And we've got a field next to the church. And so what I'd end up doing is putting on a pair of gloves, walking the rat and the glue trap out to the field, I'd peel the glue trap off the rat, and then I would do my best to peel as much of the glue off the rat, and then I would release it back into the wild. And and inevitably the rats would just come back in the building. I know that because there was one time in which on the rat trap was this rat that had this like bare spot on his rear, and it was the same rat that I'd let go in the field the day before. And as I was pulling the glue off of it, it pulled the fur off of that part of his body. So like I knew that was the same rat from the time before. So they knew where their cheese was, or their peanut butter crackers and Cheez-Its and trail mix, and they kept coming back time and time again. So I don't want to kill the rats, and I can't have them keep eating like the product, because then you're gonna like be losing money on that. So what did I do? Well, I moved their cheese. I moved their snacks that they were used to feasting on in the closet, and I moved them under the cart that the the snacks that are sold off of. And I did that many years ago, let's say 5 years ago. And in the last 5 years, the rats have never found the new hiding place for the snacks, and they never really found out where I moved their cheese. Who knows? They might still be going to the closet to this day to try to find their cheese. The point of the book is that like rats don't handle change well, and honestly, like a lot of people don't handle change very well. How about you? As you listen to this podcast and I'm talking about change, chances are you got some change going on in your life right now. But the question is how do you handle change? Do you embrace it? Do you welcome it? Do you like change? Or are you kind of always like fighting against it? Like you don't want to have to deal with change. You like things a certain way, and the concept of change just really kind of offends you. I mean, I think on all level, I mean, on some level, none of us like change. I mean, if you didn't mind going, if you like McDonald's and like a Big Mac was going to taste different in any kind of McDonald's, if they announced that, hey, depending what McDonald's you go to, the Big Mac is going to taste different, like that's a change. We probably wouldn't embrace that change. We probably would fight it. Well, in many things, I have to be honest. I like change. I'm not a Big Mac fan, but I do like quarter pounders with cheese. I wouldn't be a fan of if they change that. My chicken wings. I'm pretty much a chicken wing snob, at least in terms of like the sauce. I like the traditional buffalo, just a Louisiana hot sauce. I don't want the buffalo garlic. I don't want the buffalo lemon pepper. Or the lemon pepper. I don't want the teriyaki. I don't want these different exotic sauces. I just want the buffalo hot chicken wing. Like, don't move my cheese. Don't change it. So there's some things that like I'm not cool with change, but and many things like I do like change, because for me change avoids boredom. If we're talking about rats and mice and so forth, if you've ever had a hamster, hamsters in their cage usually have this like tube tunnel system, but then what do they have? They have like a hamster wheel. And that's where they get their exercise, and it's like they get on it and they run, but they never go anywhere. It just goes in circles and circles and circles. And I have to tell you, like, to me, life can become that way. It can become very boring when you're doing the same thing day in, day out. It's like Groundhog Day, if you've seen that movie, older movie, but it just repeats itself. It repeats itself. It repeats itself. I don't like that. I don't necessarily like change for the sake of change, but somewhat of a creative person. And if there's ways that it can be done different, I'm up for doing it different. If there's ways that it can be improved upon, I'm up for improving upon it. And so I would say most things I embrace change. But I will say this, that normally, like in the church realm and in the church world, churches don't like change. And what's interesting is like we see that in the Bible, right? You've got the religious establishment that rejected Jesus because Jesus represented change. He represented change because God gave the laws and the statutes, and they were religiously following them. But the problem is they had drift. They perverted them. They changed them. One of the ways that they changed them is, when God gave these laws, let's say don't work on the Sabbath. They wanted to be careful that they would never break that law. So they created laws on top of the law to try to prevent you from working on the Sabbath. So the command might be remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, but they'll add a law and say, like, you're not allowed to walk over X number of steps, over 500 steps on the Sabbath or 1,000 steps, whatever it is. And so they would sit there and count their steps. And if they walked too many steps, then they broke the law. But that's not what the law was. And they missed out on the point of what God's word was about, what it was intended for. And when Jesus came in and tried to fix that drift, tried to fix that misinterpretation of God's law, they did not respond well to that change. They wanted to kill Jesus for it. They would get on Jesus because he and his disciples would pick grain on the Sabbath to eat. And Jesus would point out that David in the Old Testament did a similar thing, and it wasn't even an issue. And he even took it off the holy altar and did it. And that's the great King David of the past. They're okay with that, but they weren't okay with what Jesus and his disciples did. And it was never designed to make it so that you couldn't eat on the Sabbath. Jesus called them out and said, if your donkey or your ox, falls into a hole on the Sabbath, you're not going to wait till the next day to pull them out. That's your livelihood. You're going to pull them out. Well, why'd you get on me for healing on the Sabbath if like your animal, your work animal, that you're willing to rescue it and help it on the Sabbath? And so typically religion doesn't respond well to change. That's why you have these traditional churches that are still doing things the way it was done maybe in the 1500s, because churches generally don't change very well. Now, the reality is we live in a culture today in which actually the churches have changed a lot. They've embraced a lot of change. That as society has radically changed, the church has changed with it. And so the concept of churches not really embracing change, that really only applies to churches that are more traditional, churches that are more conservative, churches that are more Bible based, because there's a whole bunch of churches that have changed so much that they're not necessarily even churches anymore. So in general, let me say this about change: as you're probably going through different changes in your life, that for me at least, is I consider this change is good. It's part of the blessings that God gives us. He doesn't want us to die of boredom because things are done the same way day in and day out. Change brings different results. They say insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Well, sometimes there's plenty of opportunity for there to be better results if we would just be willing to change. And that change will bring better results oftentimes, certainly different results. Change will keep the church relevant. I mentioned that some of the more traditional churches, like they're still using organs and they're still doing a church service or a mass the way it was like in the 1500s. The problem is like we don't speak Latin. We don't talk that way. We don't really listen to organ music anymore, and change allows you to modernize that, because it's not like using an organ versus a guitar. I mean, you can worship God with any kind of music, and change gives you that flexibility to keep your relationship with God fresh and make it relatable to other people. So that's a good thing, especially in the church. Also in the church, change allows you to fix drift. And I talked about how the religious establishment had drifted away from what the intent was of God's what his word was. Well, there's been a lot of drift in the church today. Well, change allows us to move things back to where they ought to be. Change allows us to say, you know what, God's word is intended to be taken literally, and that's what we need to move back to. If you don't have change, then as the church drifts away on some of these things, there's no way to restore that. Change is central to our growth in our faith. In fact, we're told to grow in our faith. Well, if you start out with little faith and then you end up before you die with great faith, well, there was change that took place. And if change doesn't take place, then what you have is you have no growth. And that's not a good thing. So when it comes to the ability to grow in our faith, that requires change. And ultimately, change is how God can teach us like new things. When we just understand something the same way over and over again, like sometimes we kind of miss the point. But maybe God puts a new situation in our life that helps us to understand a passage in a different way. One of the ones that I've noticed is like the Bible always talks, he who has an ear, let him hear. And it's like, well, we all have ears, but rather recently I've noticed that there's a lot of people that I know that have been following different ministers or different preachers, and these ministers and preachers aren't like teaching the right things. And even if you try to bring it to their attention that, hey, these are wrong and this isn't biblical, well, they don't have an ear to hear it. And so like God has changed my understanding of how, like, even though we have ears, we can be deaf to things. How did he do that? Well, by allowing me to see something in real time that has now changed and give me a better perspective of what that passage has always meant. So God will use change oftentimes to expand our ability to even understand his word. If you're listening to this podcast, listen, we all are going to have change in our lives. The question is do you embrace that change or do you fight that change? Some of you are maybe having the opportunity to take a new job, and you're hesitant to take the new job because you're comfortable in your existing job, and you're afraid that if you take the new job, maybe that's not going to turn out well. Well, you're afraid to embrace change, right? If that's the case, because oftentimes, many times, God will put those new opportunities in front of us for us to follow, because he intends to provide for us and our family, our well-being in a greater way or in a different way, or to give us more purpose and meaning in our life through maybe a change in a job. And if we're not open to change, we're going to miss out on that. There's change in the different stages of our life and our family. Like if you think about it, like when you've graduated college and you're just starting in the career field, like that's a certain way. And then after that, like you get some experience and maybe you get married and you start having kids, and that's a change in lifestyle. Some of you are just at that point where you're starting to have kids. Well, guess what? Those kids are going to grow up and they're going to become teenagers. And my goodness, talk to anyone who's ever had teenagers, and there's change that goes along with that. Well, those teenagers that drive you nuts will eventually move out of the house, and all of a sudden your house is going to be crazy quiet, and that will bring about change. And then there's some of you who are listening to this that maybe you're just a few years away from retirement. And that's a whole nother set of change and can be a difficult change for many people, as our identity is so often tied to our work. And the question is are you going to embrace these changes? Are you going to go with the flow? Or are you going to fight the change? We have change in our physical ability as we age. Like when we were in our late teens and early 20s, like we were at peak performance, and we could probably run for miles and play sports all day long, and maybe not even be sore or hardly ever get tired. But the older we get, like the physical activity, the repetitive motion starts taking a toll. All of a sudden you have trouble like lifting your arm over your head to put on your shirt, or when you're getting up and getting moving after waking up in the morning, or getting out of your car or sitting around for a few hours. The first few steps you're like hobbling like you're 100 years old. Like physically, in our ability to do things, it changes over time. And do you embrace it or do you fight it? Our cognitive ability changes over time. Normally, as we age, maybe our memory's not as good, our processing skills aren't as good. I have to tell you, I had a conversation with someone just 2 or 3 hours ago, and he's been a member here for the longest time, and I hadn't talked to him in a while. And he came in to see me, and I was so glad that he did. And he was like 80, 81 years old, and he was sharing with me that he still does consulting work with his old job. Well, I remember when he worked for his old job and when he retired from his old job, and like 15 years ago, he's been retired, but they're still using him for consulting work. And I said, man, that is like high praise, high honor, that at 80 or 81, like your old company still uses you for this work. It tells you how much like your cognitive ability has not declined. But for many of us, it's going to be a significant change. It may end up being like my father, who ended up developing Alzheimer's and dementia, and that eventually even took his life, which is a whole nother change, isn't it? I mean, we go through this life and we don't really, when we're in our teens and 20s and 30s and 40s, we don't really probably give death a lot of thought, because like, well, Why should you? You got all these years in front of you. But then as you get into your 50s and 60s and beyond, like you start knowing people that are dying, and you start realizing that you're not going to live forever. And so there's going to be some people that really fight that change because frankly they like the earth and they like everything that they're doing on this earth. And so the concept of death like horrifies them. And so how will you process that change when you get to that final stage of life that will ultimately lead you to eternal life? Here's the point is no matter who's listening to this podcast, no matter where you're at, you're more than likely going through some sort of change. And if you're not now, you will be soon. Change is constant. But even though change is constant, what is also to be constant in the midst of that change is our relationship with God. I mean, it should grow, so maybe not completely constant, but God has to be constant throughout the stages and changes in your life. If you're in the early stages and you're listening to this podcast, you need God in your life. If your kids are becoming teenagers, you need God in your life. If your kids have moved out and started college, you need God in your life. And if you're about to become a grandparent, you need God in your life. And if you're retiring, you need God in your life. And for goodness sakes, if he's about to call you home, you need God in your life. There's always going to be change. You can fight it all day long, but change is just part of this gift that God gives us that keeps the world exciting and keeps it from becoming boring. If we live forever and things never changed, I mean, in a sense, that would be hell on earth. So embrace change for the blessing that it is. But no matter what change you're going through, as you embrace it, make sure that you embrace it by keeping God at the center of that change so that he will guide and direct you in that change, and that it will be healthy change and change that ultimately grows you into being a greater disciple and a greater follower of him than what you were the day before. I thank you for joining me for this episode of God Talk, and I hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. God bless.